So we should be live now. We're live. Oh, actually, we're
Okay, I just took my last hit.
in about 10 seconds. Not live yet, but we will be.
So is
So
it still
here,
morning or what? Oh yeah, it is. Just barely.
so Dan, we're live now, according
Well,
to
good morning. Good
good morning.
morning, Emil Amok.
Good morning. Good morning to you, Dan. It's
I like calling you Amok.
Amok. Well, it's funny because sometimes people will see Emil. They'll think I'm a woman. They'll think I'm Emil Amok, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
they'll say, "Hi, Miss Mock," or
Emil.
or and and
That's it.
and and so it's a
So they're really disappointed when they turn on your video, man.
yeah, it's a little weird, but the thing is the uh the name. I mean, when you like, because I did that column in Asian Week, right?
Yeah,
Called
yeah.
Emil Amok. That's why I use it, and I've been doing that. I did that column starting in 1991, and since
Wow.
then it migrated.
Wow.
Since then, the column has migrated to the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund,
You
and
realize that's 30 years, dude.
yeah, well, and I continue to have written a column a week. So, I am the self-proclaimed longest running Asian American columnist in the ethnic media because I don't know of anyone older who's written a column longer. And so through Asian Week and through ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund blog, that's the way it's been. And then also Inquirer.net and some other Filipino papers like the Hawaiian Philippine Chronicle out of Honolulu. But I mention Asian Week because this is a portion that we're going to call this week in Filipino American history. TWIFAH. So that's TRIFA. So this
Yeah, you
week,
got to be careful, man.
so
You
this
might
week,
pronounce something that's like about genitalia or
yeah,
something.
no, no, this week in Filipino American history, I mention this only because it's important because the fact that I wrote that column in Asian Week was because of one James Fang. James Fang of
Yes,
the Fang family, and
yes.
I don't want to be remiss in not mentioning the fact that James Fang recently
It's
died,
passed away.
passed away, had a heart attack on his drive down to LA, and that's a that's a bad. I mean, he deserves to be at least feted for keeping alive his father's dream. His father was John Fang, who said, "I would like to do a Pan Asian publication that would cover Asian Americans, which includes that runs the gamut. Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, everyone, Indian,
Vietnamese, yeah.
Vietnamese. I mean, he really wanted to be this, really present this Pan Asian vision. And
Hmm.
so I honor James Fang, who lived up to his father's dream, John Fang, of keeping Asian Week alive, and now the the his other brother Ted Fang remains. And the latest I've heard from Ted is they want to bring the archive of Asian Week out for the public because, as we know, Balitang, right, the ethnic news is important in terms of the first draft of history, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And
And
so,
Asian Week was very incisive on several issues.
yeah,
Um, they 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 took both critical positions from whatever side, as well as having objective analysis.
yeah.
So I really depended on that paper. As a teacher, it was a good source for both critical analysis as well as objective journalism. And several of our friends, right, from across the ethnic network,
Yeah.
contributed or were regular reporters for Asian Week. And a couple of
Well,
students, a couple of former students of mine,
it,
I mean, they cut their teeth working on Asian Week the same way that a lot of Filipinos cut their teeth working on the old Philippine news.
Right. Well, the ethnic press, the ethnic media is more important than we realize.
Absolutely.
And I think that when you look at Don Mabalan's book and any other piece of serious scholarship, when it comes to when it comes to Asian American or Filipino American history, the reliance on ethnic media, the reliance on Filipino American newspapers. I mean, Don's book, Little Manila's in the Heart, relies heavily on, well, heavily it relies a lot on Three Stars, which was the Filipino paper in Stockton in the 1930s. So I think at some
Well, she
point,
also she also dips into other papers that were as long lived as
right,
Three Stars, and the competing newspaper was Philippines Mail
right,
from
right.
Salinas,
Right,
and
and I don't mean to you know to downplay those other ones. And the Philippines Mail, I believe, was started by Alex Fabros's father. He was
no, no, he was definitely a featured writer, and but it was my grand uncle who started it, and it started as a legal length uh, ditto mastered
yeah,
paper, mimeograph paper, and as Philippines Mail. So it literally was like Philippines Mail because it was in letter format and all that kind of stuff. His name was, he gave me my first set of binoculars, but his name was, I still have them,
yeah.
believe it or not.
But
Uh,
well, this is important,
he
and
was a Gonzales. He was my father's uncle.
because I've seen the byline or I've seen the name on the masthead when I've seen copies of the Philippines Mail, and I just want to point out the importance of the Philippine ethnic media in in terms of gathering Philippine history and in fact being the first draft of Filipino American history. So I mentioned that in this, I guess this is sort of the inaugural this week in Filipino American history, which I'm going to do Saturday and Sunday. The my name, by the way, if you're just joining us, is Emil Guillermo. During the COVID period, I become more Filipino than I expected, only because my hair is so long because I can't get a haircut. But I have discovered the proper use of the tubao, and
Tubao, yeah.
I have different tubao, and
Yeah, but
I
I liked it when you were trying to use it as a malong.
yeah, well,
It was
it's
a
a
little, it was a little scanty. It was a
yeah,
little scanty. You showed a little bit too much.
well,
Finally figured it out. It went on your head.
this is the thing, these are Filipino American now because I'm using it during the COVID crisis, and what Filipino Americans are doing during COVID is a part of history. Anyway, we are open.
I'm wearing a bahag, but I don't think you want to see that.
No, 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 no. Oh, hey, Dan, we have young kids out there. No,
What's a bahag? A bahag's not a big deal. I mean, it's a loincloth. I mean, what's
we
a
all right. That's true. That's true. We are here live on Facebook Live because ordinarily we'd be doing something like this at the museum in Stockton. We'd have our regular programs, but I thought this was a way to go on Facebook Live to bring the museum virtually to the public, the virtual museum to the public. So even though you'll go to our Facebook page at FANHS Museum on Facebook and it'll say we're temporarily closed because yes, in fact, we are temporarily closed unless we are an outdoor museum, and we're not an outdoor museum. We can't be open. So we're closed again. We've been closed for 5 months. But just this month, we decided that, hey, we should be, we should go live. We should bring the museum live virtually to the public. And so we're doing these pop-ups, these virtual museum pop-ups, and we're calling this one, well, there's two things. We had a pop up last week. We had Ty Buckhold talking about her mom, Thelma Buckhold. We're talking about
yeah?
not just Filipino women voting. Well, Filipino women couldn't vote, but it was the history of women's suffrage, 100 years recently. And we thought, what better than to talk to the daughter of the first Filipino American female legislator in the U.S., Thelma Buckholt in the Alaskan state legislature. So that was that, and that interview can be seen recorded on our Facebook page at FANHS Museum at Facebook. And then we began our discussion on Filipino politics with my guest today. You see him here on the screen, Professor Daniel Phil Gonzales of San Francisco State University.
So,
And Dan, we kind of fizzled out. We had a bad connection, and we had to end our long discussion. But I wanted to invite you back today so we could discuss just the fine points, or to finish up the fine points of our discussion, and then also to talk about how the how Filipino to continue on the discussion of how Filipino politics, Filipino American politics evolved. Mind you, and I say this as a disclaimer to all those watching, all those listening, this is not a partisan discussion. We are not for one side over another in any political issue. This is an historical discussion of how political, or how Filipino politics has evolved over time. And we go back to 1913 and the Jones Act, which said that the Filipinos are here. Well, at some point, the Philippines is going to be independent. So there was a hint or a clue. But for the Filipinos who are here, where do they fit in society? And we covered all that in our first discussion. And I think in general, that you can say about the discussion, Dan, is that we show that where Filipinos are today can be traced back in history, and we can see where the influences on where Filipino Americans stood on politics really was determined by the Philippines, by Manila, as much as it was by Washington. Is that a fair observation?
more than fair, more than fair. The complicity, for example, of many members of the leadership of the Katipunan with the colonial U.S. Colonial power shaped not only the early years, right, of the relationship between the United States and the Philippines, but it shaped the relationship up to the current moment through both the colonial linkage as well as the neo-colonial linkage. You've seen all the way up to martial law, the question of whether or not Marcos was going to remain in power was decided by Filipinos in the United States who had some influence on the Reagan administration, which had been very friendly towards Mr. Marcos. Dianne Feinstein had developed a relatively friendly relationship with the Marcoses. And because she had been treated so well on her visit to the Philippines, she felt compelled to be reciprocal in the way that she treated the Marcoses when they came here to San Francisco. I disagreed with many of my colleagues, particularly those that were holding staff positions in local government, in the mayor's office at that time. But obviously, my voice was one, again, crying in the wilderness.
Well,
A position that I've grown quite accustomed to occupying over the last 50 years or so. Yeah.
the point is that the Philippines, because of the relationship from 1898 on, very complicated relationship with the U.S., and really did define how politics was viewed by Filipino Americans here. And a lot of it depended on why you were here, how you immigrated, when you immigrated here. And you were talking about Dianne Feinstein and, Filipinos and the close relationship with the Marcos. But let's not forget that it was George Bush who praised Marcos for his adherence to democratic values, right?
Right.
That's a famous quote you can look up on YouTube.
See, now we're going to get in trouble now because people are saying, "Oh no, you're taking a political position on the issues."
We're not taking this is we're just taking the historical view, and also showing that it's a complex thing about why Filipinos take the kind of political stands that they do, and the kind of you talk about political strange bedfellows, how you can find radicals in San Francisco breaking bread with someone like Henny Lopez, a capitalist from the Philippines in exile here.
Yeah,
Um,
but the Lopez's were not by no means hardline conservatives. They're conservatives and they're business people, and they were very powerful. They were probably the strongest challengers to the Marcoses, even as they had to leave. I think both the Lopez's and the Osmeñas, right, from Cebu,
right.
represented very strong potential challenges, in addition to the Aquinos themselves, and Benigno Aquino particularly. But yeah, I think last time we left off talking about how the pro Marcos, anti Marcos, pro martial law, anti martial law uh, factor, that phenomenon in the Philippines influenced Filipino American political behavior. And I stated in my classes that the division generated by that situation, right, still influences the way people regard each other within the Filipino American community.
Right. Well,
I have not done a survey. I don't have you done any
no.
casual kind of survey or discussion with people on that shows a relationship between the position they had taken during martial law and their contemporary political affiliation, Republican or
All,
Democrat or
all I
independent?
all I know is that since martial law, the Philippines has been less important to people. The Philip the since martial law was the lightning rod that galvanized Filipino American communities. But
Okay,
since martial law, you saw people rally around Filipino veterans issues, right?
right,
But I did not see the same kind of focus on, say, trying to keep people power afloat, for example.
right, right.
I did not see people say, "Oh, we got to save people power. We have to save Cory Aquino, or we have to get rid of Iraq, or we have to get." I saw nothing like that subsequent to the Marcos anti-Marcos thing.
Yeah,
See now,
I haven't been back to the Philippines in about 2 decades,
yeah,
and
well,
I have to remedy that.
well, yeah,
But the issues that we observed while we were there are still very much the same issues now. What's interesting is a lot more people feel that economically it's gotten better in the
the
Philippines,
Philippines.
and so like those people who say, Mr. Trump has done a good job because they have more confidence in the Republicans and in Mr. Trump to do well economically than in Biden and the Democrats. And the same is true in the Philippines. Uh, and I'm not quite sure how they're measuring that. Okay. But what was disturbing to my family, and I don't just mean my immediate family, because we were all together in the Philippines in 2000 or so, but my extended family as well, is that attention was not being given to the poor in the Philippines, and people instead, well, they did focus on the poor, but they focused on drugs.
Right.
They focused this. I'm talking about 20 years ago. They were talking about the effects of shabs, shabu. Remember that?
Yeah,
And which is essentially, methamphetamines, right? And they were talking about that. And so here we are, 20 years later, and one of the reasons that people seem to favor Mr. Duterte is because of his crackdown, both directly and indirectly, on drugs. But the people who are being killed in the street are users and low-level street dealers, not the people who are most responsible for funding, this massive business of drug manufacturing and drug dealing in the Philippines.
well, it seems like and this is also a function of the immigration waves since 2000 to America. That a lot of people who come here now feel closer to what's going on in the Philippines than they do
Yeah,
to say yes.
that's true for each successive generation, and
But
we have a very large continuous, right,
and
immigration process of
I
Filipinos to the United States. So
but you
that means that there's always going to be a large segment of our community that's looking back, and not really identifying. This is one of the places where we left off last time,
right.
was that they really don't identify with being American. And a lot of people are hypercritical of that. I mean, that they're expressing a cultural nationalism, and not just a cultural, but a political and cultural nationalism. They're expressing themselves as Filipino. That is not always good, right? They question the authenticity of Filipino Americans. They
And
question
yet,
the use of the term Filipino American, right?
and yet, as you say that, to say you're a proud Filipino and to look toward Manila instead of Washington, you almost are saying, "Hey, look, this is a neo sense of my Philippine values. I'm showing I'm Filipino by caring about my ancestral home and my
Right.
motherland,
And
and
that's fine. I
and
think that's a
that,
good thing.
and that's a part of my history. But for a Filipino American like myself who was born here, it's an awareness of things going on back there that maybe the U.S. can have a hand in. But there are people who have come subsequent, right, in the
Yeah.
80s,
Yeah.
and they come here. And I know this. My daughter's in Washington D.C. and she hangs out with these people, these organizations, and instead of talking about the Democrats and Republicans in Washington, they're talking about let's help this stuff in the Philippines. They're talking about Philippine issues. They're talking about Duterte. They're talking about and 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 that's their perspective.
What?
And
Why is she in? Which daughter is this?
oh, this is my youngest daughter. She's in D.C. She's
Oh, okay.
just hanging
I
out.
just wanted to remind you. I think you might have two of those. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But she's working with a lot of these newly immigrated families, and like I said, their perspective is on what's going on in the Philippines.
Okay.
And does that hurt us when we talk about a Filipino American identity here?
It only hurts if they do it to the exclusion of looking at U.S. issues that affect the quality of life for our community here. It affects us that way. It also affects us negatively from here. When everybody asks me what should we be doing, my top of my position is, one, you got to be getting the facts. That's number one. And number two, you have to be building coalitions, because our community is not big enough, even though it's one of the largest Asian immigrant communities. It's not big enough to influence single issues all by ourselves. Okay, there are some communities that have such notice and such level of political participation as it is, that they can influence as a single community, right? What goes on a national level. Um, and I think the best evidence of that is South Asians right now. Okay,
South
because
Asian.
there are so many. Yeah, I mean, they're in really high influential positions. Uh, it kind of cracks me up, right? We're in the age of COVID-19, and so as Filipinos, we're very aware of the contributions to life saving, and the kind of danger and the kind of level of life threatening responsibility that Filipinos are taking on, as not only as nurses, but as med techs, as doctors, right, as hospital administrators, and we're very evident in that regard. Okay, but we still don't get enough credit. I mean, I can't remember the nurse's name, but the gentleman that was on with us like about a month and
Oh,
a half
yeah,
ago.
Jim Scorp, and
Yeah,
people can go to
and,
my.
and he was just fantastic. I mean, I think we ought to check in on him on a regular basis.
I do.
I would implore you that we check on him on a regular basis and have a little bit of discussion about what that. Now, there's a massive improvement in New York, but that hasn't occurred elsewhere in the country. And I think he has a legitimate perspective in terms of commenting, and he may have connections with other Filipinos in other parts of the United States. We're going to get the straight story
Yeah.
from Filipinos on the ground,
Well,
right? When there was when American forces were getting ready to invade Iraq, right? Way back in the 90s. Okay. There were CNN reporters on the ground as people were evacuating from Kuwait, right, and UAE towards wherever they could get out, right? I think they were into UAE. So what cracked me up was this thing. CNN's got people on the ground, and the reporter starts talking to an American soldier who's not going to be able to tell you everything, right? Because they're on a mission, and they don't, they're not going to disclose. So they're going to give you a minimal amount of information. But he stuffs the microphone in this guy's face, and he's noticeably Southeast Asian, and I think he's Filipino. Okay. Now here's the real laugher. There are crowds of people moving behind him, and it's at night, and so the lights from the camera are picking up these people that are walking behind this guy, exiting the country, and they're Filipino. Okay. And of course, we know that there's Filipinos all over Kuwait and UAE, right? In large numbers,
Yeah.
Mostly men, right? But large numbers. And the reporter completely ignores the opportunity to interview these people about what they're doing, what's going on, and where they're going.
Yeah,
And, it's just really stupid, just absolutely stupid. And I was screaming at the television.
As a media member, they're looking for the people who mirror their audience, and their audience is generally white.
Oh, and you're going to find a whole lot of white people, right? Coming out of Kuwait.
All right. So Dan, let's go back to.
People ask me, how come you knock CNN? Well, there's one damn good reason right there.
CNN they have some issues, but generally I find that they're less opinionated and more newsy than some of the others.
I absolutely agree. MSNBC is more opinionated. However, they also cover the issues with a greater degree of depth. And when you now, my point was, when you look at who they call on as experts, particularly in the era of COVID-19, right?
Yeah.
The vast majority of people are people of color, number one, okay? The highest number are usually South Asian or Middle Eastern, right? And then the remainder are some kind of Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Filipino. There it is, okay? There it is.
They don't interview.
No, not enough.
Filipinos. Yeah, well, I agree with you. And that's why you mentioned the nurse that we spoke to, Jem Scorp, out of New York. Very important interview. I believe you can see that interview on my personal site at amok.com.
We'll
again. But, this whole thing about where Filipinos are, and I just want to make this final point about, this past week on Friday, they celebrated the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech. And, I wonder how many Filipino Americans really relate to that.
Not many.
Current ones. I mean,
not many.
If you were born here in the 50s and the 40s, if your parents came early, I mean, you were part of the civil rights struggle. But if you immigrated here in the 1980s, the 2000s, maybe
even in the 1970s. Even in the 1970s, it started to loosen up, right? In the early 1970s, but then because the Marcos regime was worried that people were draining the Philippine economy, they started cracking down on a number of people who could leave, and they cracked down on how much money they could take out. So I saw some wonderfully clever ways of smuggling dollars. From the Philippines into the United States. I was mind blown at how well they were covering that. Baby powder was a biggie.
Yeah. Well, but Dan, tell me why is it, do you think, that there's this disconnect between recent immigrants and the civil rights?
It's tied to your earlier question. How do they identify? And if people don't identify with being American, and there's a wide range, right? There are those that don't care about whether or not they identify with being American. There's those who have a minimal, right, commitment to that, but at the same time who bother to take on citizenship and go out and vote, right? and they're split on between the parties, on which way they're going to go. They are very personality oriented, right? And a lot of Filipinos like Trump and hated Hillary, along with most of America, right? They had the same questions. Then you have the cultural nationalists that we were talking about, and they also are a broad range. There are those who want to be authentic about the culture, and that's where their fixation is, right? And there are those who are so critical of anything that appears to be not Filipino that they're becoming they go beyond authenticity. They go to rejection. So they reject people like me. I'm not gonna include you in that, but they reject people like me because I'm too American. Uh,
I've had that happen to me too. I mean, this is the thing about when you say a term like
but you have that trace Filipino accent, so you should not suffer
my
the
my
kind of consequence.
my Filipino accent is that of Omaha. It's Omaha Bright. But no, I know what you mean. I know, but look, the accents that I heard growing up were really, my mother and my father's accent, because my mother was Tagalog, my father was Ilocano, so which makes
Oh,
mestizo,
so he
right?
rolls his R's. He
But
rolls his R's like there's no tomorrow.
no, no, no. The thing is, the what they couldn't speak to each other except in an
In
accent.
English.
Right. So the only thing I know that is Filipino is an accented English, which is why I can still hear that sound to this day. I can still hear that sound.
You sound like a morning show on the radio in
Oh, that is
Manila.
the sound. That is the
the,
sound.
the
And
the local morning shows. They always hire Filipino Americans, right, to do the TV
they
shows
do.
because they have no accent.
Oh, this the DZAY. Welcome.
Yeah, that's where they want us for that. They want us for that, man.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of Filipino Americans right here from the Bay Area,
What,
man.
in the Philippines? In the Philippines?
Yeah, making it on
Oh,
TV. Yeah,
I,
hell yeah.
I didn't know. I didn't realize that. Look,
Oh yeah.
Dan. So here's the thing. So we talk about all this. We talk about the history, and it brings us to another point that I want to mention, and that is in this week in Filipino American history.
Oh boy.
They had, and then this just crossed the wires on Friday. We had a highway in Daly City that is going to bear the name of the person known as Tita Alice Bulos.
Oh, Alice Bulos. Yeah,
And I know anyone who is involved in Filipino American politics,
yeah.
you know, knows, has seen,
Alice Bulos. Yep.
touched by Alice Bullis. And they're going to name a portion of Route 35 in Daly City. I think it's the one that takes you past Saramonte.
Yeah, it splits off of 280 and it goes along Skyline.
Well, they're
Yeah.
going to the state legislature approved a resolution. They're going to designate that little stretch, that little leg of 35 into the Alice Peña Bulos Memorial Highway.
That's
And
cool.
now people are going to start raising funds for the cost of signs. And I just think that's really neat. I knew Alice.
Yeah, yeah.
I went to her funeral. I was saddened at her funeral. There, look, let's face it, California is mostly Democrats. The Republicans are in the minority, and Alice did fight for everyone, but most of the politicians she dealt with were Democrats, and so Gavin Newsom was there before he ran for governor.
That's right.
He was there, and it kind of shocked me because he was laying low. He was just kind of candidate Newsom, but he showed up at Alice Bullis's funeral.
Yeah.
And I made note of it, but people should know Alice Bulos, born 1930 in the Philippines, went to Santo Tomas. She was a professor of sociology.
UST. Yep.
USD, yeah.
Yep.
And she was known as Tita Alice. And when I first met her in the 80s, really, a firebrand, right? She was tough. She was a tough woman. And
She was tough, but she was safe.
she was,
She
yeah,
wasn't a radical,
yeah,
but
she wasn't a radical. She was an
yeah.
academic, and she helped and connected everyone. And
I was one of her select chauffeurs for many years, so I used to drive her home a lot.
well, I just think it's great that Alice was remembered, and I use that to bridge into a discussion, if you will, about the current state. We just finished two conventions, and we're going to talk about both equally and fairly. Once again, nonpartisan, uh, uh, fair, just to
We're,
sound
we're gonna try to be nonpartisan,
well,
but it's
we're
kind
going
of
to try to
tough.
be nonpartisan. But I mentioned it because look, the ultimate goal is to get people excited enough to take part and to vote,
There it is.
to be a part of this and to understand more about the issues. So let's take we just finished the Republicans. Well, let's take the Democrats first. Although I think we mentioned it somewhat,
We
but
did.
we come out of the Democratic National Convention, and there's Kamala Harris,
Yes.
Indian. She's part Indian. She's part Jamaican. People now have to mention it. In the past, and I've mentioned this in my columns, she herself was very reluctant to say anything about her Asian side. Although, if you do a Google, you'll see she has talked about it in the ethnic press. But now she has to acknowledge it. Everyone acknowledges it. What does this mean to the broader Asian American community and to the Filipino American community? Is it a positive thing? Is it a plus for
It's a
us?
very positive thing. First of all, I think the reason that anyone who is of bi-ethnic uh, character with a bi-ethnic background, particularly when both parents are immigrants, right? You got to be sensitive to the fact that the I'm going to call them right wingers because I think the term conservative has been used and abused by people who claim to be conservative, and they're anything but conservative. I have to tell you, that's the way I teach my class. I put up a whole bunch of positions that were taken recently by people who claim to be conservative, whether or not they're Republican or independent or even Democrats. And I ask, what makes this position conservative? What makes separating children from their parents at the border a conservative thing? How, and some people come up with intelligent responses to that, right? But
Well,
anyway,
look,
let's go back to your original position.
well, wait, as long as you're on that one, the point is it's very complex as to what is conservative, what is liberal, what is Republican, what is Democrat,
That's right.
and one of
And
the
what is Trump? And what is Trump?
well, forget about Trump, the person.
It's Emil, I have tried and tried, and it's so difficult to
Look,
forget about him.
let me just finish my point though. That because I was stunned when the parade of black men and women went out there, and the term was or the
Four
phrase
people is a parade, huh?
well the phrase was used that it was Lincoln, right, and the Republicans who freed the slaves, who voted for the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment. The Republicans, Republicans, Republicans. And yes, it's true, but it's only a half truth because the
Yeah,
Republicans
that's
in
right.
those days
Right.
were the anti-slavery, anti-segregation party. The
Yeah.
Republicans in those days might as well have been Democrats,
Yeah.
but they were the Republicans, and the Democrats, unfortunately for the Democrats of today, the Democrats of that day were the racists. They were the
Yes.
populists. They were
Yes.
the segregationists.
They
And
were pro-slavery.
yeah, you cannot look at the terms Republican, Democrat today and look at those terms in the past and say, oh, they match up. They don't match up. So,
The Southern strategy. You have to explain that by talking about the Southern strategy, the Civil Rights Act, and
right.
you
Well,
know.
you don't even have to get to the Southern strategy yet. You can just go William Jennings Bryan
Oh
in
yeah.
1900 and say, here's a guy who was, anti-evolution, gets, skewered by Clarence Darrow, at the Scopes monkey trial, and is running for the Democrats as the standard bearer, and he's a racist.
Criticized by Samuel Clemens too.
Right. Well, so here's the thing. You cannot look this is the value of the historical perspective, which is all we're trying to do in these pop-ups
Yeah, yeah.
discussions, is to provide to people, I mean, here at the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum, an historical perspective of an evolving, not just national politics, but an evolving Filipino American politics. And if we understand that,
Yeah, yeah.
we can understand, we can maybe embrace, different perspectives and different viewpoints a lot more easily, because, it's not simply a matter of saying, oh, Lincoln was a Republican, so I'm a Republican, or the Republicans of Lincoln or the
No,
Republic.
that was the response that John Molinari gave me when I asked him in an interview. John Molinari ran against Agnos, and Molinari had been a lifetime Republican running for mayor
Yeah,
in the 80s.
you're talking about San Francisco politics there.
Yeah, but I mean, why was I interviewing him? And it was because we were prepping for the presentations to be made by people running for office in front of the Filipino American Democratic Club and in front of FAPA, the nonpartisan or bilaterally, partisan organization. And
Filipino American
so I
political.
asked him, I didn't ask him why did you switch. I asked him because it was obvious why he switched, because he couldn't get elected in San Francisco at that point if you were a Republican. And even Quentin Kopp, definitely a moderate conservative. He went independent, but anyway, Molinari said that's the party of Lincoln, and he lit up like a Christmas tree when he talked about how the Republicans had been about equality the reduction of slavery and
They
all
were
that kind of stuff.
they were in the 1860s, not necessarily in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and a lot of that has to do with what you called earlier the Southern strategy, which we won't even get into now. But that's what gave us things like George Wallace and Strom Thurmond, both of whom.
Well, if you want to talk about if you talk about Philippine American politics, you also have to talk about Philippine politics, and that's what you've been saying, right? That there's an influence across the ocean. Well, Philippine politics during the colonial period under the United States, or even Philippine politics during the colonial period under the Spain, has always been taught as politics from the perspective of the people who would become the quote ilustrados, right? And that's the upper class. That's as close as you could get to the the racist Spanish colonial class, right? The peninsulares and the insulares. And so the mestizo ilustrados are the next class down, okay? So whenever we talk about that period and the early period of American colonization of the Philippines, that's the class that we're talking about, and they're still reflected, right? The 50 families that ran everything from a mestizo perspective, ilustrado perspective, have become maybe 300 families because of intermarriage and all that, particularly with a lot of Chinese effect, right?
You're talking about in the Philippines now.
In the Philippines, but they also come here to the United States. Last time we talked about the fact that a couple of people who have successfully run for office locally, right, are from well-established political families of national repute and influence in the Philippines.
Well, they're here.
Mike Gingona.
They have scions here, so this is where they run. And
Sure.
and so, but once again, we're showing the influence of the Philippines in Filipino American, or in the burgeoning. I don't know how burgeoning it's had the growing Filipino American political sense. Now, you talk about the only Filipino to serve in the state legislature,
Yeah. Rob
California,
Bonta, yeah.
and Rob Bonta, and his mom is a firebrand activist.
Yeah, his mom and dad, yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, so you
They
see,
had a background with the early UFW and all that.
it really depends on your background. It really depends on when your parents or when your family immigrated here. And so how would you size up, since the community, the Filipino American community right now is about 60% immigrant.
And that's been a constant figure.
Right. And maybe more recent immigrants since
Yeah.
2000. How would you, I mean, I had a Lyft driver in Washington when I did my show last summer, and his name was Gleffin. I wrote about him on my Aldif blog, and I asked Gleffin if, when he came here. Came here as a baby, brought by his mother and father. in the 90s? You know, does he vote? You know, yeah, maybe. You know, he just
Right. Yeah.
he didn't have
Kind of ambivalent, a little lukewarm on that.
yeah. So where do you find? How would you assess where we are as a Filipino American community right now, 2020 politically? Dan.
Okay. Wow. The remnants. I'm going to start with the positive stuff.
Oh, please.
Uh,
Pause.
because of not because of the Obama administration, but because of the obvious attacks against the Obama administration by the early Trump administration. A lot of students were very curious about the obvious contrast in facts, right, presented by the Trump administration in criticism of the Obama administration. Okay. Secondly, they were very conscious of the obvious misogyny that was practiced by, and women have become very active. I will say that Alice Boulos is just one indication, right, of the level of activism and effective community leadership that has been demonstrated by women over the past two generations. So everything from maybe even three generations, everything from after the Civil Rights Act, which is 1965. Well, it was passed in 64, but it was effective in 65. And then especially the Declaration of Martial Law after 72, women activists have really risen, and they've also taken on government positions.
Right.
You know, I was just looking up what was happening to Mona Pasquil.
Yeah.
I've forgotten her married name, her new married, I think it's Rogers. But I was looking at what happened with Mona because I remember her from the 80s when she was a fledgling staffer
Right.
in Sacramento, right? And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, of course, she was working with Garamendi before he went to Congress. She became the scheduler, right, for the governor's office. And, you know, you couldn't get past her with for an audience with the governor, you know, without her saying you had the time.
Right.
So she was asked by Garamendi to sub for him, right, when he left for Congress. And so she was lieutenant governor for a short period of time, and I wanted to see where she was now. So I was looking her up, but she's just another example. And there's women, Anita Sanchez in San Francisco, right? So there are many people who, like Alice Boulos, maybe more quietly because they were staffers, right? So they couldn't do obvious political activity, right? We're learning a lot about what's wrong with using the White House as a backdrop for your acceptance of your party's nomination. And so political staffers have to be very careful, right, about using any kind of time or resource, right, to further a political campaign. And so a lot of these women are quietly working away. I've got a couple of former students that are now working in the mayor's office and that look like they're going to be moving up to the state level. And you know, I can talk to them, I can get information from them, but they cannot come out and do political work except in their own off hours. They got to make sure that it's off after 5 o'clock and all the rest of that stuff. So those are the people that I get my information from. They are very promising.
Right.
The younger generation, extremely promising. They're better informed. The Fox News has much less effect on them than social media. I'm still concerned, right? Because social media feed can also be misleading. Facebook is notorious right now. Today I heard that the intelligence panels are not going to be giving us updates.
Oh,
they're not going to be giving us updates. I just heard that this morning, you know. And so the only people that are going to be getting the updates are members of Congress. So again, it's going to be split between those people who are pro-Trump and those people who are not, and they're, whether or not they're strongly against Trump, they're going to be arguing about what the reality is of the intelligence around whether or not the Russians are messing with our electoral politics and particularly our next election. So this is a ridiculous position we're in, and Facebook, one of the last things that NSC came out with was that Facebook is way out of balance in terms of the amount of material that they allow to be presented that is not just conservative, quote unquote, but extreme right material.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Here's the thing about Facebook. Facebook has always said that they're just a platform.
That's right.
They want to put two Filipinos.
You know what? WikiLeaks says the same thing. WikiLeaks said the same goddamn thing. All right.
Hey, what's your language, please?
Well, but it's not vulgar.
I know, it's passionate,
Okay.
please. But look, Dan, you're right. Facebook has to do a better job, and I think Facebook is trying. Like they started thinking on TikTok, because because really, look, these are the tech giants, right? They're all trying to curry favor with the legislators and with the politicians, because
and the corporations, dude.
Corporations. I hope. Well, look, we need a saner assessment of what these tech companies are. I mean, they are media companies. They're not just.
That's it. That's it.
And look, here's the thing about Amazon and Bezos. Bezos says, "I bought the Washington Post." It's kind of a hands-on thing. Maybe it's not. Is it a platform? I mean, it gets really.
Well,
sticky.
that's the assumption that yeah.
Talking about who owns what and who's going to regulate these.
That's an issue of projection, okay? Because obviously the people on the right have used, Fox so-called news, right, is the best example of that, right? To a certain extent,
yeah.
The New York Post, and other rags like that, because they do use their positions and their ownership to push really strong, right, political positions, and a lot of them are false. They're just absolutely mendacity. Okay.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing about the whole thing about the rules of ownership. We've gone back and forth. When I started my broadcast career and I worked in San Francisco, KRON TV Channel 4 was owned by the Chronicle. Which
That's right.
A radio,
and it was,
but
it was also a NBC affiliate.
It was, yeah. Cron at that time was an NBC affiliate. So the FCC comes on and they broke up. The Chronicle broke up the newspaper, the TV station, the radio station. Now we have the duopolies coming back, and you can have one company can own 20 radio stations, and and like you just can't make any sense out of the regulations for broadcast properties or for media properties, and it's getting to the point where someone's got to do something about how these things are regulated. Because look, in some ways, thank goodness for Facebook, because two Filipino guys can be on Facebook Live putting out this narrative or this commentary, but we don't have millions of people watching.
That's the problem.
Not yet. We have a micro audience.
We do.
But maybe many more people should hear, this perspective, this point of view. But this is what Facebook says. Hey, we're a platform allowing for these two.
That's right.
To talk like this, and okay, great, but look at all the other people who talk who are less responsible than us. So I don't know if it's.
I don't know about less responsible. I think they're intentionally misleading. And
some of them are. Some of them are.
I think a lot. I mean, look at the way this kid, that just shot 3 people, killing 2, right?
Kyle Rittenhouse
in Kenosha, and the Trump campaign can't bring up the issue because there's a picture on TikTok and everywhere else of this kid that he posted himself attending a Trump rally. There's a too close a relationship there, and they can't bring the issue up and discuss it. They won't even talk about the last three killings.
Well, they haven't.
I think Trump has mentioned George Floyd, once or twice. That's about it. But how
Well,
about Breonna Taylor?
well, yeah. Look, these things. That's that's part of the way we must look at uh, these political conventions, both the Democrat and the Republican conventions, and see what was omitted. Uh,
right,
and
right.
you look at news sources, and they'll look at the Republican convention, and they'll say, "Hey, a lot of truth was omitted. There was a lot of misleading stuff. There was a lot of things that weren't said." Um, you can look at the Democratic convention, and it wasn't that anything was necessarily omitted, but they did focus on the character and
Right,
personality of
right.
Trump, not so much on a
Policy,
policy.
not enough policy.
Although there was a fair amount of policy in terms of
Yeah, but
what
it was general.
well, but in terms of what could be done for COVID, what could be done,
Yeah, yeah,
they were for testing, they were for
yeah.
spending more money. I mean, so I don't even know if policy is the place, if the political speeches were a place for policy. What's a place for policy are the platforms and the platform speeches and the platform fights. And I've
Okay. What platform?
well, that's the thing. I've covered conventions for a long time. Back to my first convention I covered was in 1984, and the idea of a platform fight was always the
That
place.
was kind of easy because it was the DNC and it was here in San Francisco
Well,
in '84.
1984, but I
Yeah,
also covered subsequent ones. The point is that the platform fight was always the key battleground, for the soul of the party, and this time, like as you said, the Democrats, they had a platform, but they were pretty much on the from the podium. They were talking about the opponent, Trump. The Republicans didn't even have a platform. They just said,
that's right.
whatever Trump wants, he gets. And this is we talked earlier about the evolution of the Republican Party. Well, the Republican Party isn't the party of Bush. It isn't the party of Reagan. It isn't the party of Eisenhower or Nixon. It's Trump's party. And so this is part of what we were saying, the evolution.
I got to disagree with you just slightly. Okay,
Yeah.
it is the party of Nixon and it is the party of Reagan, in the sense that they had a basic platform, the usual stuff, right? Small government, lower taxes, less regulation, right?
Yeah.
But then underneath that was also, Nixon was exceptional in the sense that he had very little to do with the issue of race. And he did not, even though he could have attacked civil rights, he did not. Um, in the instance of Reagan, he quietly did the same thing that Obama did, which is send refugees right back to where they came from. He had, before Obama, he had the highest number of people being denied asylum and being sent back to where they came from. And it resulted in tens of thousands of deaths because people were being sent back. Remember what was going on in Nicaragua,
Yeah.
El
This is right.
Salvador?
Right. This is right.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, all right. Look, we've got to paint with a broad brush, but basically, it's still a different party than
absolutely.
the Trump party.
It ain't it sure as hell. You didn't go as far back as Lincoln.
Well,
It sure as hell ain't the party of Lincoln.
well, we did earlier in this segment, but the point is, it's always evolving, and we're trying to, the I think if you stand back and look at both parties, you see it really does become, or the Democrats wanted to become a referendum on Trump, and Trump wants it to be, oh, there's fear and there's violence, which is a law and order, a law and order argument, which has
Which
been.
was a Nixonian argument. That was the veiled racial argument.
Well, if you look at it, look at the times in the 60s with the riots that were going on back then. Yeah, law and order was a thing. So, in some ways, this is history coming back, repeating itself in with just a slightly different look. We don't have mass You know, we have protests. We don't have the kind of, burnings, cities burning like they were in the 60s. I mean,
Mhm.
that was a serious.
Watts,
And
Watts.
Watts, Detroit, Chicago. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
what we had back then, we had. I remember growing up, we had our black and white TV sets. What to make of any of this, right?
Oh, pobrecito.
7 years old, and what do you make about this is our world going on, and we were just our little Filipino American family in the Fillmore district in San Francisco growing up, trying to wait for, I mean, the TV was our great fireplace to see where America was, and only looking back do you see, oh wow, that's where America was. So
Hmm.
um so Dan, our assessment of, well, I guess really we're nonpartisan, we're bipartisan, at least here in this conversation,
Hmm.
but we want to encourage people to vote. We want to encourage
Absolutely.
people to get excited about what's going on. And
Yeah, I'm trying to work with students now. I've been approached by a couple of people who are doing voter registration activity and all that, and I'm trying to do that now. My outreach is going to the campus organizations, and I'll be working on that as actually as soon as we end this call. But
really,
that's my hope. They're better informed. They ask more questions. They don't take hardline positions as often as the older generations do. Right now, we've got people that are dug in as supporters of Mr. Trump, and they're not that's not going to change. I mean, that I think it's probably lower now, that the people who are absolutists. But when you look at how the Republicans report on their own commitment, right? They're showing over 90% absolute commitment to Mr. Trump. So, that's not going to change. So I don't. Uh, a couple of years ago, to around when the roll up to 2018 election, people were asking, well, how do you deal with the fact that there's these people who are so heavily, in my own family, they were saying, in favor of Mr. Trump? And my answer was really kind of harsh. And it was, don't waste your time. Organize the people who are willing to listen, and build coalitions, build relationships with other groups that have strong factual and analytical perspectives. Right? That's what you got to do. Because if
right.
you're going to be wasting time on people who are just absolutely committed to Trump.
Or committed to whatever stand they take. Once again, we're nonpartisan, and but we do point out that when it comes to data, real surveys, like
That's right.
the latest survey from AAPI data, which was taken in July and just released at the time of the Democratic convention, it showed that the Asian Americans throughout the country, and this is a survey that focuses on Asian Americans. They said Asian Americans were about 59% for Biden and 24% for Trump. But there was
Right.
a large number of undecided. And they said, well, if you take out the undecided, there could be, you could see that a third of Asian Americans are for Trump.
Right.
Just a third. Now, also, polls say a third of Hispanics are for Trump. When it comes to African Americans, though, that number is maybe 10% for Trump. A
Yeah.
large number, 90% or greater against Trump. So this is why we saw the African Americans at the RNC, at the Republican National Convention, saying, "Hey, Trump, he's great for America," which is fine if that's your perspective. But we're just giving you a way of understanding and putting these things in context, and putting these things in a way that you can think for yourself, make your own judgment
Yeah.
and your own decision.
Well, but it's getting informed first,
Yeah.
and that was part of my initial answer. Now, the reason that I mentioned, the people who are always most malleable, okay, are Democrats. The so-called liberals and centrists, center left, if there is such a thing, they're most malleable, and those are the kind of people that crossed over and voted for Reagan, for example. They're so-called Reagan Democrats. Um, there was a there was no time in the past when I have seen as many Republicans who are true conservatives, you know, who are conversant beyond simply being anti-abortion, small government and low taxes, right? Uh, in basic Republican values, the free market philosophy, right? Um, that have deserted the Republican Party and criticized it as no longer being a truly conservative political institution. And that's I'm criticizing the people who still pretend as though the Republican Party is that. Okay.
Well,
Now, on the other hand, Democrats and so-called center-left people are the most willing to hear counter arguments, and they can be swayed. And I think a lot of former Democrats are now independents.
yeah.
Okay. There
Well,
are probably more people who were former Democrats that are independents at this point because they're not real happy with the positions that Democrats have taken in the past. And a lot of people were alienated by the Clintons.
right.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll say when I interviewed Republicans during the last um, the last election, I interviewed some very wealthy doctors from Santo Tomas and very wealthy around the country. They were very staunch conservatives and
Yeah. Oh yeah.
also staunch conservatives, staunch Catholics. So the typical um, issues for these Filipinos.
Yeah,
It's
but a lot of it was anti-gay, right? They're anti-gay marriage.
right. It well pro-life, anti-gay marriage, uh, pro well, and also very anti-Hillary. It was a very
Yeah.
strong
Oh yeah.
crowd because they didn't trust her. That was the thing. So we'll see how this plays out. I don't know exactly. I know the community is we have 4 million Filipinos. I don't know how many of voting age, but we have a community that is large. But once again, as you say, is only strong if in coalition
That's
with
right.
others. And that's also the reason why when people say, "Are you Filipino? Are you Asian Pacific American? Are you Asian American Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian?" Which I guess spells out APIN. Are you Asian American Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian? APIN. We have so many
Right.
different acronyms that stand for us, basically Asian Americans, and now the South Asians. And
Right.
getting back to my original question, which was about 20 minutes ago, not intended to be a joke, but uh, Kamala Harris being a South Asian,
Yeah. Yeah.
that should help Filipino Americans. That a
Yeah.
South Asian is on the ticket.
Well, yeah. I think so. I think as I'm really curious as to how they're going to manage their campaign because she's from California, and not only that, she's from Northern California, and not only that, she was both Oakland and San Francisco, right? So she's been in contact with Filipinos like crazy. There were Filipinos in her office, her DA office,
Yep.
right? And so she's definitely been in contact with the community, and she's going to be able to be conversant not only with Filipinos but across the board with all of the major Asian populations because of her background in Northern California. And that's something that no one else that I can think of, right? I think that was a strength for Obama, that he lived in his high school years in Hawaii, and he was in close contact with Filipinos and Pacific Islanders and other Asian groups, and he's very familiar with the culture. He was absolutely comfortable in those environments because for him it was a part of his youth, and it saddened me greatly that there were so many Filipinos that bought into the racial line against Obama.
I mean, the birther line of Trump.
The birther line,
Well, I,
and also just the anti-black racism. You
yeah.
know,
Well, let's see how people view this current political scene with the Democrats and the Republicans. I only mentioned Kamala Harris as being a positive for Filipino Americans because she's Asian. But certainly, if you were watching the Republican National Convention, there were some Asians. There was
Yeah,
Sean
there's
Reyes,
there's actually quite a few. Yeah.
yeah, the Utah Attorney General. There were a handful, and some who I didn't see. I was looking for Elaine Chao, who
Right.
was married to Mitch McConnell. I didn't see her very often, or if at all. But I think we're at a point where it's now time to. They're going to come at you, both the Republicans and Democrats, and it's up for Filipinos to not to dig in, but to be open and to
Yeah,
be,
there it is.
yeah, and to,
Engage, engage in intelligent conversation based on clear and obvious facts. I mean, you got to be open to basic facts, and that's one of the problems that I have with the way that political campaigns have been waged over the past 20 or 30 years,
be the
is
side.
that there's just too much garbage out there. And even though media generally, and media gets hit hard all the time, but generally the media has tried to do its job. I'd say 70, 80%, 85% of media is trying to do objective and fair journalism.
Well,
But when an element is very successful, right, in calling everything fake news,
I,
it works.
I
It
wish
works. It has its effect.
I wish that
Uh,
number were higher than 80%, but I guess that's what you're going to get in a marketplace that includes many. It's varied and it's diverse and it's different. So, but one thing that came out from a survey from that AAPI data
uh-huh.
asked they asked Asian Americans if they were reached by any campaign.
Yeah, that's right. And they said no.
Extraordinarily high number said no. It's like we're here, we're here. We want to be represented by anybody, Republicans, Democrats, all of them. All of them are okay. Does anyone reach out and say, "Hey, Filipino American"? And the answer, unfortunately, is there's not that many. Uh,
No, and it's usually Filipino. It's our own. It's members of our own communities.
yeah,
So members of our own communities that are engaged in the political process
right.
are the ones who outreach to our communities. But
Just
I think what people are looking for are the phone calls,
right.
right? That are based on our specific ethnicity and the perspective that we might have on some of the major issues. I mean, obviously, Filipinos, with more than 60% of our community being first generation, right, being immigrants, we got position on the issue of immigration, and that's a number one issue. Okay, and we also have position with regard to economics, because so many of us. It'd be interesting to see. I've never seen a survey on how many Filipinos are doing gig work, and how many Filipinos are in those areas of work that we were calling essential, right? Until they shut down all the damn restaurants,
Well,
right, and bars.
the gig work, working in restaurants and bars to get. I mean, if people don't think that their political involvement doesn't matter, well, just look at something like gig work, where the law came down about contract labor that
Yep,
really targeted the Uber drivers and the Lyft drivers, and
yep.
if you were really counting on an extra 1,000 a month from your driving for Lyft or Uber, well, it's not there anymore. And I don't really uh,
Well, there's a
use
ballot measure up,
I don't use
and
those.
it's probably going to pass.
Yeah, I don't use those services. But if you were political, then you could take action. You can go to a legislator. You can go to a governor. You can see if there's something on a national level. But that's what politics is good for. So, and it doesn't necessarily have to be partisan. It doesn't have to be, oh, this is the way the Democrats are. This is the way the Republicans are. You can be independent. And that's why when I brought up the whole question about who has contacted you, the Democrats or the Republicans,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, sometimes you've got to like do the outreach and go to the party of your choice, be it Democrats or Republicans. It's just a matter of getting involved. And
There,
you know,
there it is.
in the old days when you talked about people working in the fields, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to be with the workers or are you going to be with the guy in the house? And
Excuse me. Sorry, folks.
oh, that's all right. I hope.
It's allergies. It's allergies. Okay, this is not a COVID-19 moment. All right.
Okay, all right, great. I didn't want to bring it up until you did, but that's all right. But that's why we have this gigantic sneeze plate known as Zoom here.
Yeah,
So
that's the real reason for my mic cover right here. It just catches all that stuff.
well, but but that's a thing, right? It's when the workers in the fields that determined what they were going to be, right?
Yep.
I mean, were they going to vote for the workers or are they going to vote for the guy in the big house?
Yep.
And and in fact, that was one of the sort of when I was doing the research about the party of Lincoln, because of the South, the Democrats were were generally the segregationists and the pro-slavery and
Oh, hyper racist, man. Hyper racist.
that's why a lot of blacks were pro-Republican, you
Yeah.
know, and post Civil War and into the turn of the century, they were Republican because the Democrats are bad. So
Yep.
now sort of flip flop. So you can't go by labels. You can't go by Democrat, Republican. You got to go on the issues. You got to go on the people you trust, and I hope that people who are listening to this, I put in the box if people had a question, they could put it in the box, but I don't see any in the box. I know that some people are watching. So hello to all of those who have just joined us or have been with us for the entire time that we've been on. But I've been talking with Dan Gonzales, who's a professor of Asian American Studies at the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. And we're winding down now here, Dan. But tell me about what's going on with San Francisco State
Oh,
higher ed.
well, it's not just the state. Teachers are losing their jobs. Lecturers. The last figure that I heard was that the CSU system, I haven't checked on the UC system, but the CSU system is short 229 million right now, okay, with the opening of the fall semester. So they anticipated, obviously, a certain amount of that shortfall was anticipated by the system and anticipated also by the individual campuses.
But
So when you look at the fact that we've got over 26 campuses, right? I think it's 27 campuses now. We're short, around 10 million bucks, 9 million and 10 million bucks. If you divide up the shortage equally among the campuses, and that means that there's going to be fewer lecturers. So even though we're not occupying space on campus, because probably 90% at least of the coursework is being taught online exclusively, right? With only a bare minimum of face-to-face courses being taught. So that's not where the cost is. The cost is in maintaining the campus generally. But what SF State has done was, and I think everybody else is going to do the same thing, they've limited access to the campus. And part of that limitation is by shutting down literally all of the power to all of the buildings and almost all of the buildings, and only supplying power 5 to 6 hours out of the day on weekdays. Okay. So I don't know if I can go onto the campus and avoid contact with anyone else because I have security card key access to my building. A lot of people don't have that. I have that, as well as obviously access to my office and the mailroom. I'd like to go there and check my mailbox, and I'd like to go there and feed a plant or rescue a plant from my office.
But the point,
And I don't think I can go. I don't think I can go during the weekend. I haven't gotten a response yet from the administration. You
but
know,
Dan, what does this mean to the people of California? Not
it
just
means fewer classes. It means fewer classes. It means that a lot of lecturer faculty are furloughed or not teaching classes. Okay. It means it's going to be more difficult for students to get the classes they need, both for their majors as well as their minors and towards graduation. So it kind of depends where you are in the cycle of life for a university or college. And so if you're early on, like a freshman or a sophomore, and you're working on your general education, it's going to be tough to get your classes because there's not enough sections available. And that was always a problem, right? Having enough sections to handle a large population. Our campuses, just like schools at the district level, our campuses were physically only designed for maybe 15, 17,000 people. We got 30,000 people enrolled. Okay, so the only thing that keeps us from being hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder, head to head, right, is the fact that it's not building more buildings, it's that we're going hybridized, and a lot of people have been hybrid coursework, partially online or maybe 90% online, and trying to minimize the amount of time that they spend on campus. And that's been going on for a long time. 20 years ago, when streaming was a dream, okay, it was anticipated that it would work, but it was a dream. You should have seen the administrators on campuses. They were going nuts. San Jose went completely crazy, and they did MOOCs, with 20,000 people, right, signing up to attend classes and stuff. And I was laughing at them. Okay, I've been on curriculum committees my entire professional life. Okay, and you learn what can work and what will not work. And a lot of students are going to sign up with the potential of finishing a class with 10,000, 20,000 other people, signed up for the same coursework, okay? A lot of those kids cannot manage, right, online work and online study. They had 30, 40, 50% failure rates. They can't manage it because they don't absorb the material. They don't have the discipline to be able to handle the assignments. And so they're dropping out like crazy. So San Jose State had one of the highest failure rates going for 3 semesters consecutive. I talked to a couple of the administrators about it, to the president of Cal State Hayward or East Bay, and we're both laughing, saying, yeah, well, that's going to last about 2 minutes. And that's exactly right.
Hold on, Dan. What does this mean to the Filipino American community and the students who use CS?
Most Filipinos told me last semester that they're going to continue to take courses while they're at home, okay, because they're saving that money. At least those people who are from out of town, right, they're not having to pay rent. And you know how rent is in the Bay Area, right? It's really bad. So they're saving that money, and so they're willing to do online coursework. I'm just saying, they all say that the quality is not as good, and it varies, right? It varies with the teacher. Some people are really good at it. Some people are not. And then to have this sudden shift last semester, right, from some people who hardly ever use the web, right, all the way to being online only, man, can you imagine how difficult that is? So now we've had that. We've had the summer to prepare, and maybe this semester I'm hoping will be better. But I've seen a whole lot of names that were on our lecturer list last year, right? Gone.
I know that's like, hey, so Dan, we got money problems in the state of California. We got fires. We got all these things. We got Dan with allergies. What can we? I don't know. And we're still fighting COVID. We're still shut down.
Well, that's the main reason that all these problems have occurred, right? Is the lockdown.
The museum shut down again. Right. It doesn't look like we'll be open for at least another month.
Well, one of the big political issues is, where's the assistance for people who are not employed right now? And once again, even if we take, once again, a hard line, nonpartisan position, the Democrats have had something proposed from the House for 3 months now, you know, and the Senate has refused to even take it up. Uh, you know, they still haven't come back.
Yeah.
You know, they're not coming back until next week, right? To DC to do any kind of work, and I doubt that they're going to sign off, even though there's extreme pressure. So we've got a real problem. Just from a strictly nonpartisan point of view, I really feel fear for the economy right now. I really fear for the economy. You know, people aren't paying rent. People aren't paying mortgages. That's going to go up, right? I don't, you know, people were buying cars. That was amazing, but I don't know how they're going to pay for them. And landlords aren't going to be able to pay their mortgages, right? So the banks are going to be sitting there having to make really hard decisions. They're lowering their interest rate like crazy. So, you know, some people are seriously considering refining because the rate is ridiculously low. I
No,
mean,
I
you
mean,
can get a 30 year for like 2.5 or something, you know?
that far. Well, you know, like if you're paying 4.5 or 4 and it dropped down to 3.
Yeah. That's big.
Yeah.
That's big. That you know, for a $500,000 mortgage, you know, you're talking about at least the 800-900 bucks a month difference,
Yeah.
right? With that kind of drop.
Yeah.
So that makes a huge difference. But but it doesn't matter if you don't have a job, you know.
Well,
Uh,
this is the thing, and it's one of the things that I'm asking people who are watching this virtual museum pop up, and that is, what is what are you doing? What are you doing? Not what are you doing about a certain issue, but what are you doing about during this COVID crisis?
yeah.
And I want
Literally, what kind of activity you're engaged in? Yeah.
right. I want them to take their phones. Right. I want to take a phone, take a selfie, take a picture, send them to me at Filipino Museum at gmail.com. Filipino Museum at gmail.com. Of course, we are the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum, but for simplicity's sake, Filipino Museum at gmail.com, and send me a picture of what you're doing during the COVID crisis and tell me what your situation is. And if you want to come up on one of these pop-ups and share your story, because primarily these pop-ups are about sharing your story.
That's it.
And
That's it.
we got Dan Gonzales' story about the woes of the California State University system, and also the woes of the political system. Well, it's not really the woes, but the challenges of the political system on reaching out to Filipino Americans. And look, believe me, if we don't talk about these things here, this really substitutes reach out by
Yep, it does.
Republicans and the Democrats.
Absolutely.
They're not reaching out to you. And if you're not looking in the paper, well, look, we'll talk about this because you know that you should at least be paying attention. And if you're paying attention, maybe then you'll take the next step and say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm an independent, I'm a whatever you are. The point is get involved, be engaged, and vote. Go out there and
Also, take the census.
oh well,
Turn in the census material.
you know, Dan, I'm going to do this tomorrow. We have a pop-up scheduled for noon tomorrow. Um,
Okay.
I'm going to talk about it, but what? Give me your 30-second pitch on the census.
Regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of whether or not you have the right to vote, regardless of your residential status, right, citizenship or not, it's really important that Filipinos get counted as accurately as possible, that everybody get counted as accurately as possible. But this is extremely important for Filipinos because our community uses a lot of government services. Okay, we have an increasing number of people in my category, senior category, right? And this yeah, you know what? I don't know, Emil. You're forever young. You're just evergreen, Emil Amok. But some of us age, some of us age, and a lot of us have aged into Social Security era, and it's really important that we have an accurate count so that our representatives, whether they be elected officials, community advocates, right, unelected leaders of our community, that they have the basis to be able to make advocacy, effective advocacy, right, for our communities. It's
I mean,
really important.
you're right, Dan. And this is why I am doing a pop up tomorrow on the census. So I'm going to leave it at that. Come back tomorrow at 12 noon Pacific. I'll talk about the census. I'll talk about conversations I've had with several people on the census. It's not pretty. I mean, uh, there will be an undercount. There
Right,
will be an undercount.
right.
Didn't have to be
You're talking about a general undercount.
well, no, a specific undercount of Asians,
Okay,
Filipino Americans.
okay.
Unless we see some kind of miraculous thing happen. I will talk about that tomorrow. So please be here on this pop up on Facebook Live tomorrow at 12 noon Pacific. I'll be here to talk about that. In the meantime, I shall say goodbye to my good friend Daniel Phil Gonzales, Professor Sampson.
Signing off.
Thank
Yep,
you,
yep.
thank you very much for everything, and
Thank you. Thank you for putting this up.
well, for your perspective.
Everybody get out and support the museum and FANHS generally. Uh, I'm also a member of FANHS San Francisco, as well as the National FANHS.
And
And I'm looking forward to a post-COVID conference in Seattle. Aren't we supposed to do that in like 2022 or what?
yeah, it's going to happen, but we're still talking about it. But look, I mean, I don't know if we can talk about post COVID yet. We're still in COVID one, really, right?
Yeah, no, but I'm talking 2 years
Oh,
down the line. We
hopefully,
could be hopeful about that. It
I don't
depends,
know.
I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. We should just have a lot of the
Yeah.
Filipino, health experts on.
Yeah, well, I want people to know that I'm serious. These pop-ups are intended to be um, storytelling things where we talk about what's going on in our community now, the history now. Just like you would come drive to Stockton to come to the museum, and you'd come into the museum and you'd see me and you'd say hi and you'd tell a story about what's going on. You'd walk in the walls and maybe you'd see someone who looks like your father or someone who did something in the 20s or 30s as depicted in the pictures that we have of people who worked the fields or people who worked in restaurants. You know, this is what the museum is for, to spark these memories and then to establish and create new ones, talking about your life in the context of these historical things at the museum. So, in lieu of being able to go to the museum, we have these talks, we have these pop ups. And so I encourage you to, we'll be here Saturday and Sunday, 12 noon. We'll do these pop ups. Some will be longer, some will be shorter. And then we'll also, this is also in lieu of the Sunday afternoon programs that we have. But coming up, we're going to talk about the Far West Conference. You know about the Far West Conference, right, Dan?
Yeah,
A lot
yeah.
of people don't know about the Far West. They say FWC, Far West Conference. Is that like a football conference? No. I mean, really, you have to be connected to people who were involved with that to know the importance of the Far West Conference, and we're going to talk about that in a subsequent pop up. We're also going to talk about different areas of Filipinos around the country: Chicago, New York, Texas, Houston. Uh, we're going to talk about them right here on the FANHS Museum pop up. So, once again, Dan, thank you very much. I'm
Thank
Emil.
you.
This is the virtual museum. Remember, the museum is where you are. Really, the museum is where you are, and you're here. The museum's open, even though we're closed. We could do both at the same time. Through
Physically closed.
we're physically closed, but through our
Yeah.
virtual,
Digitally very open.
yeah, on Facebook Live, we're here. So thank you for joining us. There'll be a recording. If you missed any or most of this, you can go back and see it all. Um, my name is Emil Guillermo. Dan Gonzales is my guest.
Daniel Phil Gonzalez signing out. Thank you very much, Emil, for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Dan,
All
and
right.
thank you everyone here on Facebook Live. And now I have to end the end the live on Facebook, not live. I don't want to end the Zoom meeting. Um, hold on, Dan. Stay tuned. Stop.
I'm getting ready to hit the leave button.
Okay, I'm going to stop the, no, here, I just